Tonic, The Economy of Certainty, An Introduction to the Typology of Islamic Legal Theory by Aron Zysow, Harvard University, 1984, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The standard example of a tradition rejected on the grounds of its incompatibility with analogy is the hadith of the Musarrah, apology no Arabic given, reported by Abu Hurairah, who dies in 5'8", commensurate with 6'7", 8. The Musarrah is a she-camel, ewe, or she-goat whose udders have been tied until they swell and give the appearance that the camel is rich in milk. It can thus fetch a higher price on the market. The tradition which condemns this deceptive practice lays down that the buyer has the option after he has milked the animal of keeping it, if he is pleased with it, or if displeased, of returning it with a sa'a, which is a unit measure of dates. The stipulation of a sa'a, so a sa'a is 4 handfuls of an average man's quantity, so the amount he can hold in his hands is a mud, and 4 of those is a sa'a. This stipulation of the sa'a of dates is incompatible with legal analogy. For compensation for fungibles is the equivalent in kind, and for non-fungibles the monetary value. How then can a sa'a of dates compensate for the consumed milk? Abu Hurairah is not one of those who are known for legal skill, and the tradition is rejected. The point is clearly made that this implies no belittling of the reporter. The position we have just outlined is that of Isa bin Abban, who was followed by Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, who dies 432, commensurate with 1041, and most of the moderns. Among those is Fakhr ad-Din Bazdawi, and he was the most prominent one in that camp. We know that Isa was in fact charged with spreading a slanderous tradition on the authority of Ali, that Abu Hurairah was one of the 30 antichrists who were to come out of the Islamic community. Thus, Isa's distinction between jurists and non-jurists among the companions was, for some, an invidious one. There was another Hanafi position of importance which held that the unit tradition was to be preferred to analogy in all cases. This is the position of Abu al-Hasan al-Qarhi. It too has its prominent followers. It was the teaching of Abu Yusr al-Bazdawi and of his student Ala ad-Din al-Samarqandi. They claimed that the distinction based on the juridical competence of the reporter was a new one, for which there was no support in the teachings of the early masters. Abu Yusuf is even supposed to have accepted the traditions of the Musarrah, the camel with the tied-up udders. The argument of these scholars is that the probity and exactitude of the reporter were a sufficient guarantee of his faithful reproduction of the tradition. His familiarity with the Arabic language ruled out the possibility of misapprehension on his part, and his probity excluded the possibility of his having altered the tradition in such a way as to add or subtract from its meaning. Thus here, as in the case of the Mursal, the principle of the sufficiency of probity is one of ruthless simplification, impatient with the fine distinctions of Isa bin Abban, but those who held this simpler doctrine were not thereby bound to accept the hadith of the Musarrah or other traditions which fell into the same category. These traditions, they claimed, had been generally rejected by the school, not because of shortcoming in the reporter, but because they conflicted with the text of the Quran and the authentic traditions. The second set of criteria against which a tradition must be tested is of a different sort. These criteria are based on reason and are Mu'tazila or Mu'tazilite in principle. That they were not accepted by the mainstream of the Mu'tazila is a further example of the line that divides even those Hanafis who are most likely linked with the Mu'tazila movement from the rest of their theological colleagues. Failure to satisfy these criteria is tantamount to discontinuity. The first doctrine to be considered holds that when there is a general need for a legal rule, ma la ya'um bihi al-balwa, apologies in Arabic given, that rule will be transmitted at least to the level of a mashhur tradition. This means that a unit tradition which purports to regulate matters of this sort is to be rejected either or abrogated, mansukh, or as having been subject to a lapse, sahu, in transmission. Thus the transmitters are not accused of outright fabrication, but merely of being insufficiently informed or attentive. The basis for this doctrine is the Prophet's obligation to spread the message as attested to by the Quran. From this, one reasons that the Prophet would not allow his nation to violate the law regularly through ignorance. The Prophet is thus bound to see it as the rules of the main to see to it that the rules of the main institutions of the law reach an adequate audience, who will in turn transmit the Prophet's directives on a broad scale. Two steps then are involved in the working out of this doctrine. The first deduces from the Prophet's overall obligation to promulgate the revelation his obligation to set a multitude on the right path, tawqif. Barring some calamity, this multitude will transmit the prophetic teachings to another multitude, and so forth. This we know by common experience. There was also a version of the argument which mitigated its Mu'tazilite character. The initiative is now that of the people. Instead of the Prophet being under an obligation of promulgation, the people will necessarily inquire as to the rules regulating so common actions. Stay tuned for many more parts.